Welcome to Decision Space, a podcast about the decisions in games. I'm Brendan.
I'm Jake.
And today we're here to talk about Tom Lehman's Res Arcana. Jake, how are you doing today?
I am doing great. I'm really excited to dive into this conversation. How are you?
I'm doing so well. This is a game that I've anticipated talking about for a really long time. And I think we had some really interesting games playing it. So I'm excited to dive into it. It's not exactly the game I was expecting it was, but I think that's going to make for a really interesting episode for us.
I totally agree. I think there's a lot of interesting area and decisions to explore here.
Awesome. So we always like to start with our synopsis. I know I took the first synopsis a couple weeks in a row. Do you want to kick us off with your rating out of 10 and your synopsis?
I thought you'd never ask. Res Arcana is a masterclass in game design that gets to the core of engine building. The gameplay glides around the table without a hitch of special cases, caveats, or any other rules grit as players work with what they've got in an almost purely tactical slapdash race to 10 points. The impression I'm left with is a game that's been refined down to the core of the idea and then refined some more, maybe too refined. I'm giving it a 7 out of 10. At the end of the day, it's a game I admire and like to play, but not one I love to play.
Awesome. Wow. There's so much to digest there. The tactical aspects, the fact that it feels maybe over polished in some ways. That was great. My take this week is a little bit less refined than yours. Mine is Res Arcana, a game where the rich get richer and you're never sure which direction the alchemy is going to go. I also rated this game a 7 out of 10, and I would never say no to playing it, but I don't know that I'm going to invest a ton of time in it.
Yeah, maybe we'll work on that as podcasters. We're supposed to disagree, damn it.
Well, I'm sure we'll find some room to disagree about things, some aspects of this game, as we dig into some of the decision spaces in it. For those of you not familiar with Res Arcana, this is a game designed by Tom Lehman of Race for the Galaxy fame. He also he did all the Pandemic expansions with Matt Leacock. This Res Arcana was published by Sandcastle Games. The art was by Julian Duvall. It's a 2 to 4 player game, and it plays in about 15 minutes per player. But before we go any further, let's jump over to the rules overview, and we'll dive into it a little bit more deeply for those of you who haven't yet played the game.
And before we do even that, let's just do this at the beginning of the episode. For those who are keeping up with the show and want to follow along, next week we'll be covering underwater cities. So get your plays in of that now.
Res Arcana is an engine-building tableau game where players take on the role of mages, utilizing artifacts, magical items, places of power, and their mages' innate ability to grow and transmute the game's 5 resources. Ultimately, players will spend those amassed resources on victory point granting cards. Victory in Res Arcana is achieved by scoring the most points in the round where one or more players has reached 10 or more victory points. A game of Res Arcana is comprised of multiple rounds during which players take mini bite-sized turns, activating their magical item, building artifact cards based on their resource cost, discarding artifact cards from their hand to gain resources, utilizing the effects of artifacts they've built and added to their tableau, or buying powerful monument cards and places of power cards from the center of the table. Each player starts the game with 3 artifact cards from their 8-card artifact deck, and these cards may be discarded for 2 of any resource, 1 of 2 different resources, or 1 gold, the game's special but not wild resource. At the start of each round, players draw a new artifact card from their deck and gain any resource income designated on cards in their tableau. Once players have utilized their tableau to its maximum potential, or earlier if they'd like to be the first player to pass, giving them 1 victory point in the next round and a first opportunity to select a new magical item, they may pass, ending their actions for the round. Once all players have passed and selected a new magical item, players ready all the cards in their tableau and start a new round. As always, this is a nuanced game with lots to learn about, so I definitely recommend taking a look at the game or glance at the rulebook if you'd like to understand it a little bit further before we dive into the conversation. So hopefully that gives you a little bit more sense of the game and how you can approach playing it. But before we get into the decision space of Res Arcana, there's a few different sort of key areas on the table that I think if we highlight, it'll give you a sense for the game. And if you've already played it, it'll give you a sense of where Jake and I are at in terms of where we focused our efforts or are thinking about the game.
That sounds great, Brendan. So, I mean, the core of this game is you're dealt a deck of cards, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so you're dealt a deck of cards, and in this game, these cards are called artifacts. So, really, the way I look at the game, these cards are core to what you are trying to accomplish. It's all about those cards and which ones I'm choosing to play in front of me and which ones I'm going to discard for resources.
Yeah, definitely. That 40 card deck of artifact cards, each player is dealt 8 at the beginning, or there's a few different ways you can play. There's a drafting variant too, but I think we'll primarily talk about the just sort of randomized cards. But so you're dealt these artifact cards, you have 8 of them, and they really dictate your potential paths and strategies. They're sort of like the fuel of your engine, and they're your input. And then they're also the engine itself once you've built certain aspects. But then also on the table before you, there's a host of magical items. Each player gets one of those a turn. We'll talk about those some. They pass back and forth. They're sort of interesting systems with giving up a little bit of maybe if you pass early, you get a first pick of the items, but you won't be able to pick the ones the other players have. There's some interesting dynamics there. You're each dealt a starting character, a mage, that sort of gives you one core action or sometimes two that you're able to do within the game, or maybe a discount for in some cases for building different things. And then there's also places of power and monuments. These are sort of the end goals. They're the destination that you're trying to get with your artifact engine. Building these essences to sort of pump resources into the monuments or into the places of power, which really are the way that you score ultimately in the game.
Right. You could almost think about the monuments and places of power as the shop, right? These things are available. The places of power, there are 5 available at the onset of the game, and they all have a very high cost. So that takes some time, or, as we'll talk about later, at least some commitment of effort in order to get them. And the monuments, similarly, are also worth points at the end of the game. They're worth 1, 2, or 3, and they all cost 4 gold. And you'll have 2 always available that you could purchase, or you could take the top one from the deck. And there's only 10 of those in the game. So, towards the end of the game, there's may only be 2 or 3 left, and you might have a reasonably good shot at just getting the one you need by taking that top blind card.
Yeah, definitely, which is a really interesting sort of decision from a design perspective to have such a limited pool that players, once they've played the game enough, have a strong sense of what's there. And I think tied to that are the places of power. We mentioned that there's 5 used in every game. Those mechanically, just so those of you listening, if you haven't played Res, those are these sort of oversized cards that are double-sided. So there's ultimately 10 places of power in the game, but only 5 that are ever used. And the combinations are really dynamic, but they're always being pulled from the same small pool, which keeps the game constrained in sort of an interesting way. And I guess before we get into the sort of different interesting decision points specifically, we'd be remiss to mention what you're doing with it, not mention what you're doing with your engine. And fundamentally, what you're doing with your engine is converting resources, red, green, blue, black, and yellow, the sort of special but not wild resource, into different resources, trying to amass them, and then dumping them into those monuments and places of power, or maybe into artifacts that you've built some too.
Yeah, and the monuments and places of power all have abilities too. So it's not as though you're just buying victory points that do nothing. Some of the monuments may allow you to draw additional cards, get more resources, and the places of power can similarly increase your income once you've had them. And they often allow you to pump the resources you're generating into them for additional points. So, for example, there's one card called the Catacombs that costs a bunch of the black resource in the game, which I think is called Death. But it's one of the 5 colors in the game, and it not only produces it, but it gives you the ability of you're able to pay 5 death at a later point once you've had it to basically put a death marker on it, indicating that's worth an additional point. So it accrues in value, and it gives you a way to focus your engine even further. And a lot of the places of power work similarly.
Yeah, and those places of power from what we experienced, Jake, and I guess maybe before we jump into the decision points specifically, each of us could talk a little bit about our experience with the game going in and
Yeah,
maybe
let's
how
do
we
that.
ended up playing it. Yeah, you dive in first because I know you have a really interesting history with this game.
Yeah, so I was really excited when I saw this game pop up on Board Game Arena. So there's a plug that you can go play it for free there. I didn't actually realize this, so I think it might be helpful to other people. It is marked as a premium game, which implied to me initially that you had to pay for the membership in order to play it. But that's not the case. The premium membership only means that you're able to create a new game of it. But anyone can go to Board Game Arena, create an account for free, and just join a game of Res Arcana. Those are happening all the time. And play with random people. So you can definitely try it out there for free. So anyway, that plug aside, uh, when I saw it pop up on there, I was really excited to play because this is a game I own and a game I've really enjoyed playing. And in fact, I wrote an article in February of last year, almost exactly 1 year ago today, in fact. And I did it my top 10 games of all time. And on that list, I put Res Arcana as my number 9 favorite game. It was a game that was new to me at the time. I'd probably played it, 10 times or so across 3 or 4 play sessions. And it was a game that just had really wowed me in those initial plays. And I even indicated in that review that I thought of all the games on that list, I could see Res Arcana moving up the furthest. So it's a game I love, and when I saw it pop up there, I was like, we have to do it for the cast.
Awesome. So without veering too far into review space, what do you feel like were the top two things that wowed you about Res Arcana when you first sat down to play it?
I think this game just exudes like craftsmanship of game design. I feel like every single card, every place of power, all those starting mages, they just gave me like a curated feel,
Mm.
which is hard to put into words. But I think it's something like that just comes across when you first set out to play this game, that like this is a game that is so thoughtfully designed and is really worthy of study and exploration, and that's something that really appeals to me. And then the other thing about it is I found this game like a really great, almost gateway level game. I think a lot of games of similar ilk in this kind of like engine building and even more generally a card game space where you're trying to like create combos, and build an engine, really kind of suffer from rules grit at times, where there's like the way all the cards interact like necessitate the need for not necessarily errata, but just like special cases, and not understanding like if these two effects are happening, which happens first, why and how to resolve that. And I just find that Res Arcana is so clean to play. There's just aren't those special cases, and yet it still provides that really satisfying engine building experience in such a lean and compelling package. And this game in person is really beautiful. And I think that's something that's important to bring up since we've been playing primarily on Board Game Arena. It's like a small box. It's really well packaged together, and the components feel nice to play with. You mentioned the big oversized cards. It also has those wooden essence bits, so instead of just seeing numbers tick up on your screen, you're like collecting piles of these nice looking wooden components in front of you, and that I think feels really fun and satisfying in person in a way that you don't get playing online.
Yeah, definitely. And the essence tokens too. I love that they're all different shapes. They're not just different colors. So it works for sort of colorblind play too. That's amazing to me. This Res Arcana for me was a game that I had been tracking for a really long time because I really enjoyed Tom Lehman's previous game, Race for the Galaxy. And Res Arcana has a similar visual linguistic style, right? So that's what I think is so key about this game too. If you're listening and you've played Race, you know that icons and iconography play a huge role in communicating how the cards work. And that's definitely the case for Res 2. There's a little bit of a language that you have to learn at startup, but because the iconography is used so consistently, it's what eliminates the potential for edge cases that you might see in a card game where cards fundamentally break some of the inherent rules of the game. That's the idea of sort of card games like this. But because of those icons, the rules are so consistent. And I think that makes the learning curve well worth it. And once you, I would say, spend 10 minutes learning the iconography, maybe not even that, it's so easy and all the cards just make sense. There's not too much text to digest and it really clicks.
I was going to say, is there any text?
Oh, just so little, sometimes in values, right? But really not a ton.
Yeah, basically zero text on the cards,
Yeah.
which is something that like you can almost miss. And I think that says a lot about the design in and of itself, as you're saying. Can I just do one petty criticism?
Please. Yeah, get all the stinkies out.
So obviously this game hasn't risen into my top 10 just based on my rating. And I think we'll get into some of the gameplay reasons for that as we talk about the decisions. But another reason is like, this is petty and subjective, but I don't love the theme. I mean, it does loosely get into, there's kind of like some loose alchemy stuff that makes sense with the conversion, but it's also just like a very generic fantasy stuff, dragons, potions, mages, and that just doesn't do anything for me. But more than that, I've had a hard time introducing this game to people because it just like, it could not look more like a gamery game.
Yeah.
You know, in a world of where we have, you know, Wingspan and stuff like that, I just like, if this game was about butterflies or birds or, you know, some interesting culture in the real world, I think it would be so much more accessible to folks. And like my mother-in-law, for instance, she played Tzolk'in with me and Bridget over winter break, and
That's
she
awesome.
saw this game, and what she said was, I can't understand that just because of the theme. And like, this game is way easier to play than Tzolk'in. Like, that goes without saying, but it can really be off-putting to some folks just because, you know, it just reads in a certain way.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the fantasy artifice doesn't have a huge payoff. It's not creating an entire world. It's existing within this sort of like fantasy milieu type space that like we're just pulling from here a little bit and here from a little bit. And like you kind of get the idea. It's sort of like nudging the player, right? Like the idea is that the theme fades away. There isn't world building, but there is fantasy. And I think that probably is one of the great weaknesses of the game. Though the art is beautiful.
The art and components are beautiful. It's a lovely package. I just felt like that was because I've had that experience. You know, and similarly, my wife says the same thing. You know, it just doesn't appeal to her thematically. And I think as we're trying to like welcome more and more different people into the gaming space and hobby, you know, I don't know that we need, you know, when a game could be thematically be about anything, as this one certainly could, like it doesn't have to be Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah. Totally. And there's definitely dragons being pretty specific there too. There's really powerful dragon. Well, whether they're really powerful, there's very expensive dragon cards in the game.
Yeah.
Which is sort of interesting.
But anyway, that's all. I just felt like, you know, that was worth bringing up. But let's get into the decisions if it's okay with you.
Yeah, no, I'd love to. I think one thing for the listener too, Jake and I were trying to sort of figure out how to tackle the decisions inherent in this game, because I think our experiences with the game sort of complicated the way that we wanted to approach how we would lay out the decisions. But I think the best starting point for us to tackle the decision space in the game is to talk about turn one strategy. Res Arcana is a game of almost entirely open information. Not completely. There's hidden cards that you have in your deck, though you generally know what they are. There's some hidden monument cards. But from there, you generally can see everything at the outset, which makes picking your path to victory a pretty important, I would say, aspect of starting the game.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I mean, there's also hidden cards that exist in your opponent's deck, especially if you randomly deal it. But even if you draft, you don't know which cards they're holding in their hand. But that doesn't feel like it does in many other card games, because not that there's no interaction, but the interactions are very consistent. Like you can just assume that there's probably going to be a dragon in your opponent's deck, and all the dragons essentially have the same effect. So, you know, I don't find myself really ever caring what my opponent's holding in their hand at any given time. I just care how many cards they have, because that can let me know, you know, how many resources they can rush out to generate, and that could impact the race itself.
Yeah, definitely. And that being because you can always discard any card in your hand to get 2 of any one resource, or two different resources or one gold. And that is such a more powerful effect than a lot of the cards end up having in the late game. But factoring into the sort of setting your turn one strategy, I feel like what's going through your head when you're sitting down to starting playing a game of Res Arcana, Jake?
Yeah, so the question you're immediately presented with when starting a game of Res Arcana is which of two starting mages are you going to select? Everybody's randomly dealt two. They all function similarly, but different enough that the one you pick really matters. They may provide you a different type of resource or a different special ability. Some mages allow you to protect yourself from a dragon attack, where others allow you to reanimate one of your artifacts to get two uses out of it in a single turn. In a variety of different abilities. There's 10 total mages in the game. So I'm looking at the two I'm dealt, and then I'm also just trying to take in all of the information that's immediately available, of which there are three key things. There's the cards in my deck. You get to see your whole deck, and you get to see your starting hand before choosing your mage. The other things you're able to see is which 5 places of power are out on the board. As Brendan mentioned, there's always going to be 5, and there's going to be some consistency in those 5, but you'll have a different combination each time. And then finally, it may also matter which of the 2 monuments are revealed as options early in the game. So that's kind of the information I'm taking in when I'm deciding which mage to pick.
Yeah, definitely. At this point in the game too, and I guess dialing in on the mages some, as we were playing, how easy or difficult do you feel like the decision around selecting your mage was?
I think that is a very dynamic question because it really depends which 2 you're dealt, right? If you're dealt one that seems to function well with your deck and what you're trying to accomplish, and one that doesn't at all, then that's almost, the question of viability can almost make that feel like a not choice.
Sure.
So the only time when it's really hard, I think, is if you've got 2 that seem pretty much even in terms of their viability. So then that might be a bit of a challenge. But in that case, if they're pretty even, they're pretty even, so it might not matter that much. So I'm more likely to say, oh, you know what, I haven't used this one very much, so I'm just going to take that. So I guess I would say, to me, the decision space felt very small, almost regardless of whether there was a close decision or not a decision at all.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that with regards to the mages. There's a couple that I'm almost never gonna pick. There's the healer that just prevents someone from attacking you, and getting that power at the start of the game can feel a little bit weak. I ended up playing it once and I felt like I was behind because I didn't have the advantage of maybe the artificer who gets a discount on building artifacts, or the duelist who gets to pick one of the resources at the start of each round just built in. Or there's even, which is the one that sort of mimics research, Jake? Do you remember the mage that lets you draw a card?
I think it might be called Scholar, and it's
Scholar.
The way essentially draw effects work in the game. There's a magic item that will be that gets passed around that works the same, the mage, and then at least one artifact card that you can build from your hand, and they all cost 1 resource to then draw a card. And that's the reason that's so strong, is because, as we mentioned, you can discard a card for any combination of 2 resources. So, drawing card is almost always strictly better than just generating 1 resource of one type, because it's always going to be that, but it could also just be any type, whatever you need. The only time it wouldn't be strictly better is if, for some reason, you have to play that card that you draw as part of your strategy. Though, I think the times that would come up and it would be right to just hold it as opposed to doing whatever else you were going to do in the immediate now are few and far between.
Yeah, definitely. And there is the opportunity cost of discarding it, so taking that 1 extra turn rather than just getting it naturally, but I feel like that's pretty minor. I would say too, the more interesting decision immediately following your mage is figuring out what your turn 1 strategy is going to be. You can see those artifact cards in your hand and you can see the places of power. And for me, this is the most important moment in Res Arcana, because this is the moment where I decide what direction I'm going for almost the rest of the game. I found when I was playing games of Res Arcana that it was really difficult to pivot between strategies, and I almost had to decide my direction from the outset. Pivoting is possible, but the cost, if there's not an overlap of resources in terms of time spent to sort of transition my resources from this direction into this other direction, usually feels really high. But I really enjoyed about Res Arcana the sort of sitting back, okay, I have my mage I've picked. I like that I get to pick it, even if it doesn't feel like the richest decision always, that they're generally functionally equal in some ways. But then I love sort of the pathing puzzle of looking at the artifacts that I have, the artifacts that I know are in my deck, and the places of power, and trying to figure out where I'm going to run.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, and I think that's true, right? To me, when I think about Res Arcana and we think about decisions and whether they're tactical or strategic, this game feels purely tactical from that point on.
Yeah.
Because you're just trying to facilitate that turn one strategy, and if your strategy, and I think we should say, to the level I'm at with understanding this game, the turn one strategy basically means I'm choosing one of the places of power that's present on the board, and I'm saying, like, I'm going to try and get that as early as possible and tune my engine so that I can use that to pump as many points out of it as possible.
Yeah, and when we were playing Jake, one thing that really surprised me, when I first saw Res Arcana, what I was really excited about it was the idea that I was going to build all these different artifacts, and then they were going to have all these really interesting, unique interactions, and I was going to have this really dynamic machine. And that happened a little bit, but as we sort of, I think, played the game more, as I played the game more, and as I got beaten by you consistently, I realized that those places of power, the costing on them is low enough on some of them that you can make round one sprints to them. So the way Res Arcana works is sort of all of your cards, for the most part, are consumed by turning them sideways. So you'll like do this effect and you'll turn your card and you won't get to use it again until everyone passes, but you might get multiple turns within each round of Res Arcana before you get to ready all your cards. And if you're managing your hand effectively and discarding and maybe start with the right places of power help, you really can make a rush to a place of power as part of your turn run strategy. And it seems like that was really effective.
Yeah, I think at this point, it's important to bring up the fact that good players and win the game. I think good players consistently, but even for players like you or I who've played the game a handful of times, I'm probably, up to the high teens in terms of plays. Not crazy, but that's more than I've played most games in my collection probably. So good players are consistently accruing 10 points or more by the fourth round. So, I mean, of course, you're going to have more turns than that because, as you mentioned, the turn structure is doing as much stuff as you want until everybody passes. And eventually, and there's always a finite number of things that you can do because then you'll just be out of resources. So you only have 4 rounds to do it. And what that means is building an artifact for example, a lot of the artifacts help you by increasing the income that you collect, the number of resources you collect at the beginning of each round. So if you build an artifact that increases your income by 2 in the first round, well, that's great because it probably costs 3 or 4 resources to get it. So you'll be able to recoup that investment and then get some additional. But if the game's only going to last 4 rounds and you get to the third round of the game, it seems really, really rare that you'd ever want to build build an artifact that's going to increase your income because you will have sunk so much into that you're just not going to be able to recoup that cost, much less gain value out of it by the time the game ends. So really, what we have started to learn is that your only opportunity to build stuff out of your hand is in that first and second round. So I think, again, that leans into how important it is to decide where you're ultimately going before the game even really starts.
Yeah, and I think that aspect of the game is something that a lot of players might really enjoy and a lot of people might bounce off of. I think if you're the type of gamer who likes games that Games in which you feel like you have a ton of agency. You can take in all this information and then make one right decision and then see if that decision pays off or not. You might love Res Arcana. There's a little bit of room to sort of mix up and adapt to other people's decisions within the game, but not a ton. If you're the sort of gamer, or if you like games where you get to just try things and see how they play out, Res Arcana might end up being a really frustrating experience for you. And a huge aspect of that is because of the importance of this sort of pre-turn one decision in a lot of ways of what your path is going to be.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. And, it's also something that means that this game is kind of dynamic as you're learning it. It's funny too, because we were playing on Board Game Arena, like I mentioned. So when it first came out, I started a bunch of games, and some of those were 2-player games, but I'm in this 4-player game, and just because of the way Board Game Arena works, that game is still ongoing. Right? So, I've learned so much about the game since I started that one game, because we played a bunch just with us two, over a lunch break, and flew through a bunch of games and did that a couple of times. And, we're in like the 6th round of that game, and everybody was new to it, apparently, when we started that game, and everybody's just built like all their artifacts. It's like the 6th turn of the game, and I'm in first place with like 3 points. So, when people first start this game,
yeah,
it might really appeal to you if you're the type of person that likes, building stuff and doing the really interactive stuff with your opponent. But then you might find over time that you're enjoying the game less and less as you realize that's just not optimal.
Totally. And because of the importance of those early round one decisions, having learned as much as we have about or as much as I have about Res Arcana since then, I feel like that game is stuck in like oopsie newbie purgatory where I'm like, I've done so many silly things that taking a turn in this feels kind of futile. Like I just would rather restart. Like let's just start a new game.
Yeah, it's like, I guess I just attack with my other dragon.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But it's fun. I mean, it was fun. It was like just really interesting to have that experience, that you normally wouldn't have. I don't know. It's like I went into the Matrix, right? Where it's like I've learned, I've lived 20 lifetimes since I started this game, and now I see all the mistakes.
Totally. You've like lapped your past self as a player multiple times on the way back to taking a turn in this version of Res. Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like one of the things that changed the most for me too, as we started to play, was I learned the importance of the multi-purpose cards. I started to appreciate how valuable discarding artifact cards is. It's very interesting because the cards themselves don't give you this information, right? They're multi-purpose cards, but the cards themselves only give you the information about what they will do once built as artifacts. And you just have to understand as a player when you're looking at your cards. And it's not a complicated rule. Of course, this is an easy thing to understand, that every card in my hand also represents potentially 2 of one type of resource, 1 of 2 types of resource, or 1 gold. And that paradigm shift was the most powerful change that happened. And I think, interestingly, this is another decision space in the game that starts really important and then really tapers off in the late game where you're not going to be building artifacts and you're just drawing cards to discard them. And then the interesting decision there, it really becomes, what do I take in terms of resources?
Right. Yeah, definitely. I think that's so interesting. And one thing that is kind of like a negative player experience for me is because of that. And I think this maybe just speaks more to knowing what to expect. I mean, that's just how this game is. But like, if you're expecting a card game, and that's kind of what it presents as, like, look, I've got this deck of cards. I'm drawing a card every turn. Like, I know how card games are. The thing I love about card games more than anything else is how exciting it is to draw a card every turn. Like, I just love that mechanic. Like, if I'm playing a card game and there's a card that says like draw 2 cards, like I'm gonna angle for that. That's my strategy now. But in this game, because of just how much pressure and how much this game is all about just slapping duct tape onto that engine you planned in turn 1, there's rarely ever is draw interesting because of, ooh, look what I drew. It's almost always like I'm drawing because I know I have to discard this regardless of what it is. Like I'm drawing for the resources, not the card.
Totally. That's so interesting to me because the part of the reason why drawing cards is fun, right, is because we get to see what's on it and what matters. And we just at a certain point in the game, I feel like there's players who would win this game with they would draw and not even look at their cards and just discard it, right? There's no surprise. The value of that card just becomes the resources that are there. So it totally inverts your expectations of as a player of what these cards are and how they function. And I think they work for the game, but they create this very discordant expectation based on the component that was used for me as a player.
I would say that like this game could have your deck face up instead of face down, and it would not change the game at all.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of what I mean. I say like that mystery is almost pointless in some ways. I mean, obviously not in every single case, but in the majority of cases, I think it would feel as though it was the same game. Yeah, and the other point that you're making that I think is so interesting is like this game is almost like feels like a magic trick to me in some ways
Interesting.
where it's like, look at all this, right? Like there's all these cards and oh, you're so like resource poor because you've got three cards and you can only build one on the first turn. That's how I approached the game the first time I played it. It's like, okay, I have one of each resources. All these cards in my hand cost 4, so I guess I pick one to play and then pass. But like when you learn, like no, these are all resources. Like I don't have 5 resources and 3 cards. I have, if I want, at the start of the game, 11 resources, plus I'm potentially gaining 2 more resources from my mage and a magical item that I'm selecting first. And all of a sudden it's like, wait, I have 13 resources at the beginning of the game. And it just like, I could take this place of the power that I want in this first turn of the game. Like when you realize that you can do that instead of like spending 4 or 5 turns, it like totally does change the way you see it. It's like an illusion.
Oh, illusion is such a good word for it too, Jake. It totally, yeah. There is so much artifice to the game where when you sit back and you understand the systems, you realize that it's not exactly as it seemed at all. Your perception of when you sit down to play it doesn't match up with how it's functionally played, which isn't necessarily a problem for the game in the end, because how it works is how it works. But realizing that and getting and experiencing those paradigm shifts and sort of like, this is a game where I start with an immense amount of power. And my decisions from turn 1 are hugely consequential. It is just interesting how discordant that can be. And I think the amount of agency that you have from the outset does really mean that playing this game with players of different skill level is kind of tough.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's no better example of, the trick of this game is we're talking about even now, like how this game is all about those artifact cards that make up your deck and what you do with them. And it is. And you can win this game in 4 rounds without playing a single card, right? That just seems crazy when you first start setting up and learning this game. And I should say, this is based on a thread on Board Game Geek. I didn't, come up with this on my own. So who knows if I would have ever discovered that if I was left to my own devices. But there are numerous ways that you can get to 10 points in 4 rounds by just simply discarding every card you get for resources and pumping them into places of power or using them to get gold to buy key monuments at the right time. And not only can you win with those strategies, but like some people might think that they're even overpowered. So that almost is like, wait, is this even a engine building game?
Or is it like an engine explosion game? Yeah.
Right.
It's interesting too. And I think within that thread, you shared it with me and I took a quick look at it. And it was interesting because Tom Lehman popped up and sort of said, no, these things aren't broken. We knew that these could happen, but we gave players all the tools that they would need to address that at the table. We've equipped the players with the tools to keep players going for these sort of really powerful strategies in check, which is true. But again, if you're playing with players who don't see that, if you're playing with players of differing skill levels, they might not know that they have to build into this sort of thing to keep one another in check. And I will say, you've played this at multiple players, Jake. I've primarily played it at 2. I have been playing that 4-player game that we started at the beginning. But I think I enjoy this game the most at 2 because of the zero-sum nature of 2-player games.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because this game is, according to Board Game Geek, is best at 2. And I don't necessarily disagree with that, but I think that some of the cards are definitely
Yeah.
balanced for more players. So the dragons, for example, are one of the artifact cards in the game, and they generally cost a bunch of resources to play, and they all give you 1 victory point when you play them. But generally speaking, I found that you can, it's a bad value proposition if you're playing a dragon just to get the point. You'd be better, converting those resources into gold to get a monument, which can be up to 3 points for 4 gold, or just focusing on a place of power. And the way dragons work is you tap them sideways, exhaust them, and your opponents have to discard 2 green resources, which are represent life in the game, or life essence, or whatever. And if they can't, then something bad happens. They have to discard 2 of another resource, and that is certainly player interaction. There's no way around that. But generally, the cost of playing the dragon, you have to dump so many resources into that even if it's successful and your opponent does have to get rid of a few resources, you're still not necessarily breaking even on that deal if you're just playing with one person. And there are a bunch of ways that you can prevent that damage. One, which is just passing. If you pass first, then the dragons don't do anything to you at all. So it just seems like in a 2-player game, those cards are pretty poor. However, maybe that's not true. And again, I haven't done as much at higher player counts. But if you're turning it sideways, and instead of just one person losing 2 green, 3 people are, clearly that's a lot better. I don't know if it's good. I don't know if it's optimal still. But it does change the balance in a way that makes me think, I don't know, I don't necessarily disagree that's best at 2, but I wonder if it's really balanced for better at a higher player count.
Yeah, that's the design of those cards is really interesting because you're totally. It makes so much sense that the dragons are more effective in games with more players, and I think the other cards that it might be fun to talk about that might be more dynamic with more players are the one that you used really effectively against me, Jake. That sort of said, copy the amount of resource that an opposing player has in a different type. So, for example, if your opposing player has 9 red, you get 9 black. Am I saying that right?
Yeah. I can't remember exactly what there's a couple of different artifacts in the game that work with that same kind of mechanic.
So Jake and I were playing this game where I decided my turn 1 strategy, and this is probably on me that I didn't decide to pivot. And Jake, my turn 1 strategy was, let's say, hypothetically, going for the place of power that needed 9 red. And Jake really intelligently built an artifact that said, copy your opponent's red cards. And I should have just pivoted away and said, oh no, I'm not going for this at all, because your ability to copy my progress was so powerful for you just by turning that card sideways. And then I think you had to reanimate so you could turn it back up and do it again.
Yeah,
so you
pretty much
doubled it. That was
pretty much my strategy, became just activating this one artifact as much as possible.
Yeah, and then you have all these outlets with other items where you can transmute them into other things, and maybe that gets more interesting in a more player game where people are forced to go into certain colors, so the power level of those are higher. Whereas in a 2-player game, though I tried it, at this point in time, if we went back and played a 2-player game again, I don't think I would have the decision to go up in that resource, because it's too powerful to have you just outright copy the progress that I made.
Right. And yeah, I think the way you phrase that, you wouldn't have the decision, implies that, because you just realize now that that's just not viable at all. And I think that speaks to kind of a larger dynamic about a game that is this tactical, in that the more you learn about it, I feel the decision space has been shrinking for me.
Yeah.
I don't know that as my mastery of the system increases, if it will begin to start growing again, now when I don't just know, okay, I can go for these turn 1 places of power, as I start to identify other ways to get to 10 points in Fork, if it will start to feel like a bigger or more dynamic game. But right now, it really feels like I make that turn 1 decision, and then I'm just watching the game unfold. And it's still satisfying. It's fun to see what happens, and maybe this speaks to partially because we've been playing on Board Game Arena, where every turn is essentially a micro turn. You're just doing one tiny thing and passing back and forth. It really has illuminated for me how much in each of those turns, like, I'm not really choosing anything. I'm just doing the next logical progression of my initial plan.
Yeah, it feels a lot like you're winding up the machine in turn one, and then from there you're watching how the machine plays out as you're taking the actions that you feel like you have to take in front of you. And there's certain decision points potentially within the game that I sort of want to matter more. When you pass, seems like it will be really important, and it certainly can be. Passing in a round gives you a 1 victory point going into the next round, a sort of like token that gets passed around. And it also lets you have a first shot at some of the artifacts in the middle of the table, the sort of core actions that affect how you can approach the game. But because certain players, if they're still in, their artifacts aren't in the pool, you pick an item, not artifacts, items. You pick an item the second you pass. So for me, the sort of passing decision felt less like a important timing decision rather than I'm going to do everything I can possibly do in my turn. I'm going to be the most efficient I possibly can. And unless I know that 1 victory point is going to be key to me winning or key to me denying the other player a win, I'm just going to fully play out my turn.
Definitely. I think that's right. I do love that the fact that passing first in a round is worth 1 point. I think that's a really cool game design feature. And while it's usually you're just doing as much as you can to maximize your efficiency, the game is, close enough and designed well enough that it's not totally uncommon that, the being able to pass first will be the difference between 10 and 9 points in the 4th round. And the fact that, okay, if I choose to be just slightly less efficient and forego 1 resource and I take this so you can't win this turn, like, I know my engine is built up to the point that I'll be able to go higher than you in the next round to win in 5. So I think that is there. But again, it feels more like something that just plays into the tactical fabric of what is playing out more so than, it's a really tough decision. I mean, I guess it can be a little bit of a gamble, but there's so much open information. Generally, you can just math out, like, okay, they're going to get to 10 if they pass. So I have to pass first, so I will.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And one reaction that I had to Rez that it's such a tactical decision, sort of looking at the game state and saying, okay, I have to pass here so I can get in and then get that 1 player point, deny you. Then my engine's going to be, it was more powerful, but slightly slower. And that will let me get ahead. And maybe I'm going to then snag one of these monument cards that checks for victory. I feel like there's part of the design functionally is sort of saying, here's a ton of noise and this game is going to be really hard to grok just because there's so much going on. And I don't think this is a good or a bad thing, but for me as a player, I think that it made it hard for my brain to feel excited with the progress that I'd made and not anxious about all of the other things going on that might matter some, but I just don't know that I can focus on them enough to factor them into my decisions.
I think that is super subjective because I don't know why, but maybe this is like a type of noise that my brain is just good at deciphering thanks to, lots of too many hours of Magic the Gathering as an 8-year-old or whatever. But but like, I think this goes back to our question on decision space. And if you have, our discussion on decision space, and if you haven't listened to that, it's our last episode we recorded. I think you will really gain a lot out of listening to it, but so go back and listen to it, please. But I think like how difficult it is for you to understand what your best option is going to heavily impact the subjective experience of making decisions in this game, to the extent that for many people, or just people who are very experienced with this game, more and more decisions you will realize there's only one viable option and it's just about getting to that path, where obviously when you're less familiar with the game, you'll be making more genuine decisions because you don't know yet what's better. And I think that's kind of like where I'm at with the game right now. but I don't know, again, does it grow once I just get to that next level of understanding?
Yeah, that's really interesting. That sort of at the outset of your experience with the game, Jake, you sort of felt like the decision space was going to be huge. There was all this potential for combos. Then the more you played it, you realized that the viable decision space was much smaller. And now if you're sort of like at this precipice, like maybe there is more game, maybe there is an even richer decision space, but the opportunity to the cost of getting there and the sort of play group, it would be a ton going into it. And I think that that's really how I've experienced the game too. I think that the number of, because the player agency in the game is so high, you start so resource rich, you can accomplish almost anything. It's so easy to do what you need, the right thing on a turn, the ideal thing on a turn, in any given turn, because of the high player agency nature of the game, starting so resource rich, etc. It feels like it's a game about knowing the right decision for the seat that you're in and then playing that out. What do you feel now that you've played more than 10 games of Res Arcana? What do you feel is the most interesting potential decision that you've been offered to make by the game?
Well, I mean, I should say, like, I'm not the best at this game. And you know, even in recent plays, there have been numerous times where I get to my next turn and I realize, oh, I'm 1 point short. I took the wrong magical item when I passed. If I had taken this other one, I would have been able to win. So this is not like this game is so easy for me after
Sure.
20 plays that I'm just like, it's obvious I'm always making the right decision. So there is some fun in that untangling, you know, trying to hold as many turns ahead in your brain as you can, you know, and winning on round 4 or 5 is such a small difference most of the time, that, you know, even a tiny efficiency mistake can cost you big. And I would say probably the most interesting choice generally is passing, because like being able to pick one of those magical items can really matter a lot. I mean, there are some that at the certain point in the game, like getting that will fuel you to that early win or not. I think some of the ones that really come to mind are, there's one that lets you reanimate an item to use it, or an artifact or place of power to use it twice in a single turn. You know, that one is a lot of times in the third or fourth round, that's just like get 1 point, which is huge compared to like getting a single essence or something. And then in other cases, other ones will be more important, but there will often be like, I know like this is the one I need that's out there. So it is important to me to plan out my turn that I'm doing as much as possible and passing in time to get what I need. And then I do think there is some interplay there about when you pass. Sometimes you can even like take extra turns that literally have no benefit to you just to stall, to force somebody to pass first, which is kind of interesting if you're trying to play keep away with the item that you have. Like if you're sitting on that reanimate one in the third round, you might really want to change your strategy so that you're the last person to pass, if at all possible. But I still wouldn't say that's like the decision itself is the interesting part. It's really more like the homework.
Yeah, definitely. I know I'm supposed to disagree with you because it makes for more interesting conversations, but I'm just going to agree because I think that the passing and grabbing an item is the most, maybe interesting was the wrong frame, but it's definitely the most rewarding decision point that comes up in the game. It's fun getting a new ability, a new effect that you can do with those items every turn. And I found that the decision at the outset of like, what's my path to victory from the place of power? What place of power am I going for? Generally just like, I usually, it leaves me feeling frustrated. And maybe that's because I'm not as good at the game as I need to be. And that frustrates me. But I wish there was more flexibility once you have made that decision and then committed to it.
Let's just briefly touch on drafting, because I think that's something that could really, to some people, it definitely makes them feel like that first part of the game where you're setting your strategy is a lot more interesting. I think based on just conversation I see online about this game, a lot of people really recommend that variant where you draft your 8-card deck of artifacts at the beginning of the game instead of randomly dealing them out. So we played it both ways. What are your kind of initial thoughts on whether you would recommend the draft variant, or did you find it interesting?
At the outset, I was really excited about the draft variant. I thought having even more agency over the set of cards that you would have at the start would be. I thought there would be a lot of room for interesting decisions there, and there are. But personally, the way that I've come down on it, if I'm playing Res again, I don't want to play with the draft. And I think it's because it produces opportunities. It makes the room in the game to you have to be even more perfect. It makes the game even spikier when I want the game to be more flexible. How about you?
Yeah, I also don't like the draft variant. I mean, I don't dislike it. I'm fine with it. You know, if somebody's like, let's play Res Arcana, I'm cool playing it either
Sure.
way. But it wouldn't be my preferred choice, but for totally different reasons. I actually don't think it changes the difficulty of the game because I don't think the draft matters that much. I just
Mm,
don't believe the cards that you have in that starting deck really impact has that big of an impact on your ability to win the game because discarding them is almost certainly more valuable to you than playing the cards at the halfway point of the game. So
yeah.
really it's only, as long as you have a couple cards in your deck that are okay to play first turn, that's all that really matters. And as we've discussed, you don't have to play a single card to still win the game. Depending on what starting mage you get and maybe the monuments available and places of power early on. So I feel like people recommend it because of having a bad initial experience where they think, oh,
Mm,
well, like I couldn't win because my deck didn't synergize well enough. But the more I play it, the more I realize like you can definitely win this game with any type of deck, since you don't need to play the cards at all. and so I would just rather keep the playtime down. I would rather play. I think it's just not worth the extra time to draft. I'd rather play 2 games in an hour than 1 game in 40 minutes.
yeah, well put. I totally agree with that too, Jake. So what's the future for Res Arcana and you? Do you want to play this game more? Do you feel like you've played it enough and you have a good sense for it and you've enjoyed it, but you're done with it? Like what's next with Res Arcana?
I think it's still a game that I am happy to own. It's not going on the sell pile by
Sure.
any means. I feel like there's more to unlock, and it's interesting too because I actually like Res Arcana is the last game I played with my gaming group here in St. Louis before shutdown has forced us all to quarantine up through now. And when we last played it, we had a great time. It was a friend of mine who I've played a bunch of games with before, and one new person, and we all played this game. We played a couple of times, and it was just a blast. And I still hold on to that memory of introducing this to new people and having it be such a success. I do think it's easy to teach, and if the theme isn't off-putting, it can function well as a gateway game even for folks. But I just the experience I've had is one where I started enjoying it more, and now with subsequent plays, I've been enjoying it less and less. So if that continues, then I think eventually it'll be a game I move on from. I don't know why, but I really believe that as I learn more about this game, maybe it's just faith in the designer or faith in what I perceive as like this ultimate craftsmanship in the design of these cards in the game. I believe that at a certain point something will unlock and the decision space will start growing, and that will increase my appreciation for the game again. How about you?
Yeah, it's definitely, no matter which way you slice it, Res is a game that gets better the more you understand it. And I think I would, if someone offered to play Res Arcana, I'm down. I'm playing it anytime someone says, "Hey, do you want to play a game?" I don't know that I need to seek it out and have it in my collection and share with other people. But if there was a Res Arcana app where I was just playing against the computer, I think I would be really excited to play this game that way because it is so puzzly. And I think that I am still intrigued by the potential different routes to victory in the game, and I want to explore the systems. I just the I don't know. It's such an enigma of a game because I don't. I feel bad saying this because everything about Res Arcana I wanted to love at the outset. And I have wanted to play this game for about a year. So I was so excited when I saw it on Board Game Arena and you mentioned it. And then for some reason, when we play it, it's just not the slam dunk I thought I was. It would be. So I would play more, and I would definitely play more if it was an app, but I think I've had my fill.
Can I I'll give you a recommendation to try it one time in person if the opportunity presents itself, because like Board Game Arena, and I think like with any game you're playing online, especially asynchronously, like micro turns is just kind of a fun killer. So I think that's an important note to, again, reiterate that a lot of our play has been in that format, which is not ideal for any game, but I think especially this game in some ways. So I would recommend that you try it if in the future when we're gaming with friends again, if you see it at a cafe or somebody's shelf, definitely pull it down and see how it feels with like the actual components in your hand, because I think you'll have a better time. I think it'll make more of a difference to you than you might even expect.
I think that could be a really interesting potential way to return to Res Arcana in the future too, Jake, if we do like a micro episode on, hey, we played Res in person and what was the experience?
Here's what we'll do. In a year's time, when this podcast is still going strong and we have legions of adoring fans, we will return. We'll begin doing our look back episodes, and we'll say, a year ago we played Res Arcana. What do you think of it now?
Awesome.
And so look forward to our continued thoughts on Res Arcana in 1 year.
Yes, perfect. Do you have any closing thoughts on Res Arcana before we get back to them in 1 year's time?
Okay, this was a hard game to talk about on a podcast about decisions. I think we just need to say that. This is actually our second attempt at this conversation, and I feel like it's because a lot of the decisions are small and not interesting in and of themselves, but they're all more than the sum of their parts.
I really appreciate you saying that. And I think one thing it just made click for me is one thing about Res that I think engine building games in general can suffer from a little bit is the opportunity for feedback from the game itself about how you're doing as a player can be low. You can play a game of Res and lose and not really fully understand why. And that can be really frustrating. So it is a really hard game to talk about with our decision space frame, just because you don't, as a player, it's really easy when you make a decision and you get feedback on the decision instantly. And Res isn't in the business of doing that. It gives you the ability, the room to make your choices. And then in the end, the sum culmination of them comes to some consequence. And that's why I think we go back to like your turn one decision of which direction to go in matters so much, because that's the beacon that we can look at and say, okay, this is where that's what mattered, my choice at the outset. And maybe it wasn't that, but without knowing the game even better, it's tough to be able to point to, missing this one item. I guess missing an item could be essential, but sort of something like that.
Yeah, it's like maybe there are super rich choices, but I'm not smart enough to see them.
And
I think did you like literally just hit your table when you were saying that? Because I love the passion.
Yeah, no, and we play, it's interesting because both of us, Jake, have said that this game makes us feel dumb. And like the two of us play a ton of games and we play a ton of games competitively. And I think we understand games really well. So I feel like it has to be said that that's just a feature within this game, is that it's sort of, it really pushes back on the player.
Totally. So we said we were going to try this out. Where do you put this game on the line or bell curve of decision space?
I think I'm coming down at a solid, 37. 1 to 100, 1 being, or 0 being a game of no decisions, 100 being the unfathomable or a game of intense, unbelievable complexity.
/ the game of life.
/ the game of life. For me today, 37. Where are you at with it, Jake?
I am at 11. I feel like this is, the caveat has to be said. I love small decision space games, and I really enjoy this game too. When I think of my scale from Candyland to the game of life, once I've set down my starting path, I've picked the place of power I'm going for, I feel like to some extent I'm just walking down that road to Candyland. So it's an 11 for me right now, but it'll be really interesting to see how I feel in a year's time.
Yeah. That's great. And listener, if you have thoughts on where this falls within the decision space spectrum of 1 to 100, both Jake and I would love to hear from you. And one of the best ways you can reach out is hit us up on Twitter. We have a Twitter account at Decision Spa. That's Decision SPA. Let us know what you think of Res. Do you think we got the game totally wrong? Do you think the decision space is massive and we're just bad at the game? Is there something you love about the game that we missed? We'd love to hear from you.
Are there more decisions in Candyland than we're giving it credit for? Like, please let us know.
And if you have that take, do let us know. Besides that, if you want to follow either Jake or I on social media, you can do that too. I'm at Burnside, BURNSIDEBH on Twitter.
And I'm at Jake Fried. That's JAKEFRYD. And you can find all this information including the link to YouTube, where we're also putting up these episodes, in the description of this podcast.
Awesome. And if you know someone who you think would enjoy Decision Space, please share it with them. If you don't want to nudge them to download an episode on their podcatcher, just send them a YouTube link. We'd really appreciate it. Trying to grow the podcast. So if you enjoy it, if there's something you'd like to hear us talk about, a topic for discussion, let us know. And thanks for listening today.
Thanks so much. Join us next week when we talk about underwater cities.
As we build the cities when the Earth is so overpopulated with people outside that you have to go underwater. It's hard to imagine, but I'm really excited for that discussion. And that's another game where Jake is super good. So we'll see how it shakes out.
Blub, blub. You are now exiting the decision space. Thanks for listening. Please take care and enjoy the rest of your game.